If you actually only care for the near future, for the next 5-10 years or something, then the contrail effect is relatively large to CO2. Why? Because you ignore all the future warming that is still to come from the CO2. If you care for longer time horizons, well, then suddenly all the future CO2 counts, your CO2 impact is actually relatively larger to the contrail. While the contrail effect in size doesn't actually change that much with this timescale discussion, it's the effect of the CO2 that changes.
Welcome to Sustainability in the Air, the world's first podcast dedicated to sustainable aviation. I'm your host, Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying. Every Thursday, I have important conversations with top aviation executives, technology entrepreneurs, and policymakers helping aviation take climate action. Conversations that help separate the signal from the noise. Whether you are a frequent flyer or an airline executive, if you care about sustainability or simply love traveling, welcome aboard. My guest today is Dr. Florian Allroggen. He is the Executive Director, Aerospace, Climate and Sustainability, and a research scientist in MIT's Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics. He also co-leads the MIT Laboratory for Aviation and the Environment, and the transportation pathway of MIT's Climate and Sustainability Consortium. Florian and I have often sparred about whether contrails are real, whether a scientific agreement is needed before airlines can act upon it, and we discuss all of that and a bit more today on what airlines can do to become sustainable today and till 2050. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Florian, you and I first met at the Boeing event just over a year ago, and since then I've read a lot of your research around contrails, around non-CO2. You've been kind enough to show me your tool in person that has been developed at MIT. Tell us a little about what your role is at MIT and why the interest in contrails.
Yeah, thank you, Shashank, for having me and inviting me to this today. It's a pleasure to be here. So my role here at MIT is I'm executive director for the Laboratory for Aviation and the Environment. So I oversee a lot of research that we actually do, and it's along two pillars that we do work. One is to really try to understand the impact that aviation has on the environment, specifically focused on the three big ones: climate, air pollution, and noise, which includes the work on contrails, obviously. And then there's the second big pillar, which really thinks about solutions, both technologies and policies, to really get aviation onto a net zero pathway. And that includes fuels, it includes operations, it includes new aircraft designs, and it includes really sort of like designing systems. And the contrails problem is a really interesting one because it really has this sort of like horizontal through the two pillars, right? Where you really have to try to understand impact still. There's a lot of work that's still left there. And we have to go all the way already to thinking through how could we solve the problem. So that's what I'm doing here. And my background is more on the economics and policy side, but I really love to sort of like take the deep technical content and work with my colleagues here and then aggregate that up.
That's fantastic and so exciting. I'm curious, from a research perspective, who is your audience? What does success look like to you? Before we dive into all of the research topics, is it policymakers incorporating this? Is it airlines and airports when they are thinking about 2050 goals? What's success?
That's a really good question because the success story for a research organization has sort of like different pillars, right? So on the one hand, first of all, I mean, as MIT, we are an educational organization. So what we're doing is the first and foremost thing is we're trying to educate our students and make them sustainability leaders for tomorrow. That's point number one. Point number two then is to really do the deep research that we can actually publish in academic journals that gets us the scientific credit and that actually also gets us the credibility. Then take the third step and really say like, hey, look, we've looked into this in depth and here are things on how we think about getting onto a net zero pathways, which we can then back up with a deep science. And yes, this is talking to a policy audience, which we do a lot. It also includes an industry audience. It also includes NGOs. Our role really is to help educate the sector and get it onto the path, on top of educating our students, which obviously is the first priority that we have.
Which makes complete sense, because I don't know of many airlines that hire PhDs to do research, right? They have people who run airline operations or commercial aspects, like whether to serve lunch or brunch, like some airlines are doing on certain flights, overnight or not. Let's talk about the basics around contrails. Some of our listeners may not be 100% familiar with the topic. So what exactly are contrails? I mean, they look so beautiful. So why are they harmful?
Yeah, let's talk about this for a moment. I think it's good you asked this question, because I think there is a lot of good knowledge and misconceptions about contrails. So first of all, contrails, as you mentioned, we've all seen them up in the sky. They're these white line-shaped ice clouds that you see forming behind aircraft, but they're ice clouds. And you sometimes see them forming right behind an aircraft, and sometimes you see the aircraft gone, but there is this long linear cloud across the sky, and you probably make the assumption this is a contrail, in which case it's a persistent contrail that may have been in the air for hours. And the big question is, obviously, then that you should be asking is, why do they form? Where do they come from? And the answer to that is relatively can be done relatively intuitively, because if you look at the exhaust of an airplane, about 28% by mass, what's in the exhaust of an airplane is actually water vapor. And this water vapor comes out of the engine, obviously very hot. Yet the airplane flies in a very cold environment. In fact, it actually, when it cruises at like 9 to 12 kilometers or 30 to 40,000 feet, it actually tends to cruise in one of the coldest spots that we have in the atmosphere. So what now happens is you have a warm stream of exhaust that has a lot of water vapor in it. You put it into a cold environment, and very similar to what actually happens when you breathe out on a cold winter day, you get this condensation, this little cloud that you actually form. This is what happens there as well. It's a little more complex than that. There's sort of like a role that different particles in the exhaust stream actually play, actually forming this contrail. But to first order, it's kind of the same process that you have there. And now, because it is so cold up there, and in addition, it also needs to be sufficiently humid so that this water that condenses doesn't just evaporate right away, you can now have this freeze. And there you have an ice cloud that you just formed through flying the aircraft through that. So that's the basic mechanism behind the contrail that you actually have. And now, I mentioned this earlier. The contrail, it can form and it can directly dissolve itself and disappear again, right? This is not what we worry about. What we worry about is if this contrail that you've now formed, this long ice cloud, if it persists for hours, which it can. So what does this contrail now do if it stays in the air for hours? Well, it has two effects. First, you've ever been standing in the shadow of a cloud, you know that what a cloud does, it reflects sunlight that otherwise would have hit the earth, right? You're standing in the shadow of this cloud. This can be a cooling effect that contrails have. On top of that, what the contrail also is, it's a little blanket in our atmosphere, right? So it traps heat from the earth that's trying to escape our atmosphere. So that's a warming effect. So every contrail, actually, its net effect is the balance of this cooling and this warming. And now, depending on which situation you are in, a contrail can be cooling, but it can be warming. For example, a nighttime contrail is always warming. Why? Because you don't have this cooling reflecting component that a contrail can have. So a nighttime contrail is warming. And when we look at the science right now, it tells us that the average contrail that we form is warming. Yet it can be cooling or warming, but the average one is actually warming. And that's what fundamentally causes the problem that we have here.
That is very interesting, and thank you for explaining it in such simple terms, like the breath in cold weather or standing under a cloud. It makes complete sense. Now, is this warming effect warmer than the CO2 being emitted from the aircraft? How does this stand relative to the CO2 itself?
That's a really interesting question. And there's lots of work that's going on in that area to actually look into what what this warming effect of a contrail is and how large it actually is, especially relative to CO2, which is kind of like the metric that we are all used to, right? The warming of CO2. As I mentioned, the current scientific understanding here is that on average, the contrails that we form are warming, but not all contrails are, as I explained earlier. And the other big takeaway that I think we see in this context is that most studies would agree at this point that we're on the same order of magnitude than CO2. Now, why am I not giving you a specific number here? There's two reasons that we need to talk about. The first reason is there's actually a lot of remaining scientific uncertainty around how large the warming effects of the contrails actually is. That is true for every individual contrail, and it's true for when we look at all the contrails that we form. Where is this coming from? Well, you can actually very intuitively think about this. I talked to you earlier about the contrail as an ice cloud. Well, the degree to which it actually reflects sunlight and actually is able to trap heat now really depends on what actually this ice crystal that you have in a contrail, what exactly it looks like, and how this look actually changes over time, right? These are geometrically very complex forms, and the way it actually reflects incoming sunlight and the way it actually traps radiation depends exactly on the forms that you find there. And there's a lot we don't know about what that actually looks like and how it actually evolves over time. So it's one of the big uncertainties. How long contrails persist, we have hypotheses about it, but sort of like how good we really understand it, there definitely lacks an understanding. So that's the first problem. Well, we know that the size of the effect, we don't know it exactly how large this effect is, right? So despite our best efforts, but same order of magnitude is probably a good way to put it. Then the second point that I want to talk about in this context is it also depends on how you look at the contrail effect in how you determine how large this effect actually is. So what do I mean with that? We need to talk about timescales for a moment here. And this gets a little into the weeds here, but hear me out for a moment because it's very important. If you think about CO2, you emit a unit of CO2 into the atmosphere today. This CO2 stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years, and it is warming for hundreds of years. At each period of time, this warming is actually not that large. What happens is you integrate it over a long period of time, and that really creates the large warming effect of a CO2 emission that you have today. It's the integration over time, the long duration that the CO2 stays in the atmosphere. Now, the contrail is on the exact other end of the spectrum. The contrail only stays in the atmosphere for hours. So this warming effect that you get from, let's say, the average contrail only persists for a couple of hours. Now, this is really important to understand because now you can ask yourself a question. Well, how do I value the warming in the far future of the CO2 relative to the warming of the contrail, both created by the same flight? And this is important now, right? So if you actually only care for the near future, for the next 5-10 years or something, then the contrail effect is relatively large to CO2. Why? Because you ignore all the future warming that is still to come from the CO2. If you care for longer time horizons, well, then suddenly all the future CO2 counts, your CO2 impact is actually relatively larger to the contrail. While the contrail effect in size doesn't actually change that much with this timescale discussion, it's the effect of the CO2 that changes. This is why I'm telling you, same order of magnitude is probably a great way. If you only care about today, then it may be 50-50. It may even be larger for the contrails. If you care a lot about the future, then contrails may be something like 20% of your climate, of your warming effect for aviation. So it really depends on this perspective as well, and the scientific uncertainty and this timescale discussion.
Wow, this is leading me to so many additional questions. For example, what can we do about them? You've worked on developing and applying methods for contrail mitigation strategies. Can you explain some of these strategies and how they might be implemented at actual airlines, for example?
Yeah, this is a great question, right? Because we don't just want to talk about problems here, right? We really want to talk about how we can solve the problem and how we can make a tangible impact in getting onto net zero trajectory. So I really appreciate you asking this question. Um, I want to actually take a step back on your question and um, look sort of like a little holistically on how we can think about solving the contrails problem, because you can think about different things, right? A lot of people actually are working on what we can do to the engine and also to our fuels to solve the problem. Why? I mentioned this a little bit earlier, is the formation of contrails is actually very sensitive to some of the particles that we have in the emissions plume of an aircraft. So if you're trying to actually get some of the particles down, specifically we're talking about soot in this context, this could actually help us reduce contrail impacts. And this is mainly driven by how we combust in fuel in an engine and what actually comes out of the tailpipe. And it's driven by the fuel you are using. And that could actually have an impact. So lots of people really working on it. However, we also need to realize that there still is scientific debate on whether this is actually even a promising strategy. We don't fully know that yet. So scientific uncertainty. Once we actually implement these kinds of things, also lots of engineering challenges, right? How exactly would you make a fuel that makes less contrails? How exactly would you build an engine that makes less contrails? And then even if you solve those, we all know that scaling up these solutions, getting them into the market for an engine could take decades before you really have this available on the fleet, because we do know that this turnover takes a period of time and is not just going to happen in just a couple of years, and it's right there. So these are sort of like long-term solutions with some scientific uncertainty still there. It's certainly something that we should deeply think about, or that we should deeply do some research on. I do see the merit. But of course, the question is, if this takes so long, what can we do in the nearer term? And that's a very, very important question in this context. And the most exciting and maybe most intuitive thing in this thing is to change flight path. Why is this exciting? You may have observed this yourself. You may have been standing in the parking lot of your local supermarket, looked up in the air, and you saw two planes, and one makes a contrail and the other one doesn't. Why is this one making a contrail and the other one doesn't? Well, one of the planes may be flying through conditions where it's very cold and sufficiently humid so that a contrail can form and persist, while the other plane may be flying through conditions where, for example, it's too warm, so that the freezing of these water particles can't actually happen, so you are not forming a contrail. So this is actually, to first order at least, it's not related to the aircraft. It's related to the conditions through which it flies. But if that is true, what we can think about is, how can we route an aircraft around a region which is sensitive to contrail formation, which is sufficiently cold and sufficiently humid? And this is sort of like the key idea that we have been working around here, is doing this kind of rerouting. Now, how would you do the rerouting? Is another interesting question from there, right? You could say, hey, can I horizontally fly around it, right? Just, change heading, fly around the region which is sufficiently cold and which is sufficiently humid. And a colleague of mine uses a really nice analogy there. These contrail-forming regions, they're a little like pancakes. They're actually horizontally very large, but they're vertically very thin. So if you want to fly around them, in many situations, you would fly large detours, which could delay you. And it's lots of additional fuel burn. So this is probably not what you want to do. And it may not even work in the way we today organize airspace and how we sort of like fly on motorways on the sky. You can't go to the side to large degrees, right? So what is the other strategy? Remember, they're a little like pancakes. They're not quite as thin as a pancake. They're a little like a very thick pancake. So a little like pancake gone wrong. But it's still just a few thousand feet is what we understand in most.
Maybe it's a thin stack of pancakes. Yeah, not the American stack of pancakes. It's a thin Belgian waffle or something like that.
That's okay. We can take that one. So what you can now do is you can actually adjust the altitude, and you can fly maybe. Usually it will be under, because you try to fly as high as you can for efficiency reasons. So usually we'll try to fly a little lower, go under the region where a contrail would form, and really solve the issue. Now, how would you implement that? Well, there's basically two ways on how you can think about it. There's a way that I would call strategic, and there's a way that I would call tactical. The strategic way is to say, hey, I know in advance that this region is going to be there because I have a weather forecast or something that tells me that. And I'm going to plan a flight path that avoids the region from the start, gives this flight path to the pilot before they take off, and they just fly around it. The other alternative, the tactical approach, is to basically react in flight, is to basically say, hey, I see a problem forming. Very similar to turbulence, actually, to how we avoid turbulence today. I see a problem, so I'm going to react to it in flight, adjust my altitude, and adjust. Both have pros and cons. The long-term approach is very much more in line with how we're doing planning of flights today, and how we sort of like pre-plan the route, and then the pilot sort of like puts it into action. It also helps the airline really sort of like think very strategically on how can I best avoid these regions, and there may be sort of like a little more optimization potential there. But the problem is you would need to know where contrails will form in advance, and this would require really good weather forecasts for contrails. And weather forecast today is not made for contrails. So today's weather forecasts aren't great at predicting contrail-forming regions. So there's lots of work to make this better, obviously. So this is something we definitely need to solve. The tactical approach is you would react to something you see in the air. You would try to get a real-time picture. Where is the contrail problem forming? I see a contrail. I adjust my flight path to really avoid the problem. Both have merit. In the long term, we'd probably want to combine the two. But that's sort of like the long-term vision that you can think about here.
It's very, very interesting. So all it requires is a detour in terms of altitude. Now, I remember having a chat with American Airlines, who has conducted trials on this already. And what they told me is, for sure, there was an additional fuel cost because of changing altitude, but they were unsure whether it reduced the warming contrail versus the cooling contrail. So when we speak to airlines, how do we get them to take action, given that there's certainty on the additional fuel burn, but uncertainty in terms of the impact on the contrail removal?
That's a very, very good question. And I think you're going into sort of like a field here, which is a lot about how do you actually implement this issue. I think we want to be careful how granular we are in this approach. And think about this. If you look into like lots of other environmental issues that we regulate, we do the same thing. So if you look, for example, into air pollution in inner city areas, right? What we do, for example, in Europe, right? We keep, for example, diesel cars out of these cities. Not on all days are actually these diesel cars a problem in these cities. Yet we know that on the majority of days they are, and we know that the overall benefit is largest, so we just keep these cars out of inner city areas. So the same may apply here. We may not know, and especially a priori, we may not know before we actually route a flight whether it's going to be a cooling or warming contrail. We may not even know 100% whether the flight will form a contrail. So therefore, we need to think about like, what do we know? And this is that in bulk, we have to make good decisions. So let's make these in bulk good decisions before we get very granular on the problem.
Very interesting. What do you then say to airline executives who say, oh, science is uncertain. Oh, scientists at MIT and Cambridge are still working on giving us certainty around contrails. How do you get them to act?
So if you think about making decisions under uncertainty, we all make decisions under uncertain situation all day, right? So maybe you will have been on your stock trading app this morning and will have bought some stock. You don't know whether the value of the stock is going to go up and down, but you may have done your homework and decide you will take this risk. You don't know whether it's going to rain or not this afternoon, but if you see a risk for it, you may just take an umbrella. And you may be on your on your way to work in the morning, and you see that traffic on your normal path is stopped, like entirely stopped because there was an accident. You know another route, which you know is a lot slower, and you know it's going to be a lot slower today because it's going to get congested as well. But at least you know that the traffic will flow and you will eventually get to your destination. Maybe not at your perfect time, but you will get to your destination. So why am I telling you this? We make these decisions under uncertainty all the time. And we need to ask ourselves the question, what is the robustness of the decision that I make to this uncertainty? Contrail avoidance will cost us an additional 1% of fuel burn fleet-wide. Let's make that assumption for now. I think it's conservative. I think it's going to be less than that. But let's assume it's 1%. Well, let's assume that the contrails effect is about 10% of the CO2 effect. That's probably on the lower end on what's realistic. It may most likely is, I would think it's most likely going to be small, but a little larger, but let's be conservative. Let's say it's 10% of the CO2 effect. That means 91% to first order, 90% of the aviation induced effect come from CO2, 9% actually come from contrails. So if you can reduce all the contrails, so 9% of your warming effect, for 1% reduction in fuel burn, which is 0.9%, you can still be off by a factor of 10 and you're still making the right decision on the fleet level average. So it's very important for us as we think about the system and transitioning the aviation system to zero, to acknowledge the system level argument and say, like, at the system level, this makes a lot of sense. And it is very robust to the decisions that we need to make. But I, at the same time, want to warn you, because this doesn't mean that you want to jump to action right away. You want to just go out and do it right now at scale, because the factor of 10 is great, but we know that any implementation that we will use to actually do contrail avoidance with, we will make mistakes. We will deviate flights from flight path that were optimal, and they never needed to be deviated because the flight would have never formed a persistent contrail in the first place. So you take the fuel burn hit for absolutely no benefit. We will deviate paths, and we will deviate the flight into areas where we still make a contrail. So you have the fuel burn penalty and you still have a contrail. And we will fail to deviate and still make contrails, but also don't have a fuel burn penalty. So we will miss some. All of these cases will be true. And now back to your initial question. We will make errors here. And the big question is, whatever rules we are going to use to do contrail avoidance and however we are going to do this, we will make these mistakes, and these mistakes will eat into our margin, either because they reduce our benefits pool because we actually miss opportunities, or because we increase our fuel burn penalty because we're doing things that were unnecessary or that didn't actually have a benefit. Both will happen. And the question is, and this is actually where not much work has been done, at least not at large scale under varied conditions, where we really figure out what are the failure modes of different models that we can implement to do contrail avoidance. And this is something that we still really need to learn about to answer this question. And this is where experimentation comes in, where we can do sort of like living lab conditions, etc., to really figure this out. And this is what I would tell an airline CEO. This is where your role is right now.
Well, a living lab, experimentation, these are words that are usually not found in mostly conservative airline CEOs' dictionaries. So I'm truly hopeful that the small number of airlines that have done trials, that expands and we learn more. And thank you for being open. We will make mistakes, but to make those mistakes, we have to get started. We have to try something. We have to start somewhere. You're working on a project to help create tools for real-time contrail avoidance as well, isn't it? How might this technology help change flights?
Yeah, this is basically the tactical approach that I talked about earlier. The key enabling technology here is that we started with that about 2017 here at MIT with a project with a nice team with a couple of people who are now spread all over the world doing work on contrails. So we started with a key technology there, which basically it is based on a NASA satellite that gives us a picture of the Americas every 5 minutes. And in this imagery, if we look at this every 5 minutes, we can actually see contrails. and you can see them in clear imagery and like RGB images, right? Images as we know them, under clear sky conditions. And if they are large enough, you can actually see them. But we can also see them over clouds, for example, because if you use sort of like a certain combination of different infrared images that the satellite also takes, you can actually really pick out contrails. So what we actually did here was we taught computers how to pick out contrails from these images that we receive every 5 minutes from this NASA satellite. This is a fun exercise. Lots of people here internally were involved. Lots of pizzas were eaten at what we call labeling parties, where we came together sort of like in our lab, in our group, and really sort of like labeled images from the satellite for contrails. And you can do this actually as a human because contrails have very specific characteristics, right? Once they're created, they move a little bit with sort of like the prevailing winds. They actually form very suddenly because you have an aircraft come through. So in a previous image, you don't see it. And then suddenly you see this line, right? This is not really a natural phenomenon that we see out there. So you can actually pick them out. So we taught computers on how to do this. And we basically calibrated a machine learning model that we can run pretty quickly every 5 minutes on these images to really have a real-time perspective on what this actually looks like. And then on top of that, we developed actually techniques that also allow us to pick out altitude from these pictures. So we don't only know where the contrails are horizontally, we also know where they are in altitude. Now, once you actually have this, what you can do is you can actually look at all the flights that are currently in the air, say in the United States airspace. All of them have what we call a filed flight plan, as many of you will know. So we know exactly how this airplane is going to fly. So you can intersect this with the regions where you see contrails forming. And now you can make an assumption is if another flight flew through there and made a contrail, chances are that if you fly another plane through there again, it will also form a contrail. To what extent that is actually entirely true as an assumption, that's where we'll make errors. That's where we have to do lots of experimentation and data analysis. But to first order, this is definitely a very good hypothesis. Now, what you can do now is you can do the tactical approach and say like, hey, if this airplane now changes flight altitude at this waypoint, flies around this region, and then you can decide to go back up again. Yeah, we can basically provide this kind of advice. And the way we're doing it is we're working on this with Delta Airlines. So we're basically giving it to their dispatchers. They look at it. They look at the situation. They look, can this flight afford this? And look at, can we do this kind of rerouting? And then it would go to the pilot, who then actually has the final decision on how to do this. So this is really built for experimentation at this point.
Right.
But this is the pipeline that we have right now.
It's very interesting. My understanding is that flight planning tools, these are managed by big companies like Sita and Airbus, and they power it. Is the goal then to integrate this real-time contrail mitigation functionality into an existing tool like Sita's OptiClimb, for example?
I think if you want to do this at large scale, that's what you would have to do. Right? There's no way that you can integrate this at large scale with sort of like a non-automated process. You would need to sort of provide the pilot with full awareness. I think the other point that we need to mention here is if you want to do this as large scale, we really need the air traffic control on board as well, because they will need to be aware of it as well. And if you want to do this at large scale, you will kind of like start to block off large chunks of airspace, right? This is something that air traffic control will need to be aware of. And this is one of the things that we actually don't know when we talk about fuel burn penalties in this context. We don't actually know how closing off certain parts of airspace will actually affect the ability of our airspace to actually operate all these flights. And this could be a problem for very congested airspace, like where we now sit, Shashank, over the US East Coast. This could be really tough during busy times to do. But there's lots of airspace, like especially over the oceans, oceanic airspace, where this is probably very doable at most periods of time, where this is not going to be an issue. But it's not just the flight planning software. I think we really need to talk about ATC here as well. And this is also important because number one paradigm in the aviation industry today is safety. And I think all listeners to this will hopefully agree with us that we're not going to sacrifice the safety paradigm of aviation for contrail avoidance. So we need to find ways to really integrate this safely into our operations. And at scale, we really need ATC for that. So it's not just the part about flight planning software. It really goes to ATC.
Interesting. So have you spoken to air traffic control organizations, and what's been the feedback like? Are they willing to try this, adopt it?
I mean, we've seen trials that air traffic organizations have done, for example, in Europe, right? So, but I think for that, before we really go to that, we really need to do this failure mode analysis that I talked about earlier. We really need to understand how good are we? Can we really make the right decisions? What kind of sort of like decision rules are we implementing to do this? This is the work that we need to do first before we can really go to implementing at large scale. And for that, we need experimentation. I do see a pretty significant role for ATC in that. And we do see that in Europe with some of the work that Eurocontrol has done, for example, which is obviously very important. But even if you do large scale experimentation, I think having ATC on board, it will definitely help you.
Right. So based on this conversation, it occurs to me that we don't have contrails in every region of the world. We don't have to install the software on every single flight that takes off, let's say, around Malaysia to Singapore, for example. But the warming contrails might be in this high hit areas or high impact areas around the North Atlantic or evening or nighttime flights. So is this razor sharp focus that we're looking at implementing any solutions for contrail mitigation? Am I right in concluding that?
So maybe. I would say maybe about that, because I mean, there are clear regions where you have more warming impacts, right? So where we can really think about like, okay, do we just want to do nighttime flights? I think that's a low hanging fruit, right? To focus on the nighttime at first. But we really, I think, have to think about this a little more broadly and really think about like, okay, what are the decision rules that will get us to good decisions? And, thinking about high hit areas is a good idea, but I think we really have to do the analysis to figure out what can we achieve with that? How much mistake do we make? And how robust are these decisions to some of the scientific uncertainties that we have around the contrail-forming effects? This is the kind of analysis that we need to do and that we really need to do well to get these conclusions right. And then we can talk about these things for sure as we think about scale-up implementation. But I really do see a step that we have to take first in figuring out failure modes through experimentation before we can really get to that scale.
Interesting. If you look at the future, what do you think are the most promising areas of research or development for reducing contrail-related climate impact?
Yeah, I think there's sort of like two things that I think are really important. We talked a little bit about uncertainty and scientific uncertainty in the very beginning. This is a lot related to, how contrails form, how long they persist. And the reality is there's a lot that we still don't know about that, despite all the great efforts that we've had with flight campaigns around the eco demonstrator and measurement campaigns that we've seen all over the place. These things really help us, but there are enormous gaps left in our understanding of contrails. And I think the most promising area in this context is we really need to do observation and we really need to do experimentation to understand the science, really the science behind contrails, to really validate a lot of the hypotheses and assumptions that we actually have today about contrails and how they form and how they persist. And I really think we really need to focus on observational and experimental work in this context. And this can then feed back into the models that today give us sort of like our understanding of contrails. And to be honest, there's not very many models out there that actually do that. It's a relatively small number. And we have to really sort of like have this combination of observation, experimentation with this modeling world to figure out, okay, can we really understand this impact better? I will warn you, a lot of people think like this will get uncertainties down in the contrail impact. I am not sure that is true. This may take decades to really address this uncertainty, because even if we start to address it, until we build scientific consensus around that and really sort of agree that the uncertainty is shrinking, this will take a while. So let's not get our hopes up too much. So this is sort of like big area number one.
Right.
Big area number two, I think, has a lot to do with what I talked about earlier. When we think about integrating contrail avoidance, how are we going to implement it? Are we having airlines making decisions based on tools that have been provided to them, where we don't really know what the quality of the tools are? So we'd have to really think about like how we set a standard for these tools. Is this going to be something where you have a policymaker basically based on sort of like weather forecast data or something block off certain parts of airspace because there's a high risk that contrails will form? How are we going to implement this? This is actually a really important question. And we, as I said earlier, we really have to figure out what is the best way to do this. What are the failure modes? What guarantees us in the face of scientific uncertainty that we will get a benefit out of this? And this is why I'm so hesitant about sort of like your high hit areas earlier, is sort of like, sure, this sounds like an interesting concept, but how exactly do we implement it? And what does it mean for failure modes? We really need to quantify this. We really need to figure this out so that we can make robust decisions in the face of uncertainty. And I want to mention one more thing in this context, because it's really important for me, is when we think about these implementations for now, because one of the biggest uncertainties is how does contrail and CO2 compare? I think we need our contrail systems to be separate from CO2 systems. We can't mix those two. At least for now, until we have addressed that uncertainty, we need to keep those separate. So like really figuring out these principles, this is the second big area that I really see for research and development. And a lot of that is very policy related already. And then the last thing I want to mention in this context, because it's really important to me, is when we talk about net zero for aviation, there is a world beyond contrails. So let's not put all of our eggs into the contrails basket. Equally important, if not more important, is that we get our transition to low carbon energy carriers right, that we get to the SAF, that we get to the hydrogen, that we think about how we produce this energy with a low carbon footprint. We need to talk about the role that carbon removals could play in this context. These are things that we really carefully have to think about as well, and we shouldn't forget that. We are rightly so excited about contrails and how we can mitigate those impacts. But really, we need both. We need contrails and we need the other parts. And I'm saying this because we need to keep that balance, and it's very, very important.
I find this so ironic. Because IATA, the official airline industry lobby, has put all its eggs in one basket, which is CO2. You're saying let's not put all our eggs in the non-CO2 basket. I think what's needed is both should be equally weighted. Both should be talked about. And it's not just about CO2 emissions versus non-CO2 emissions. It's both that matter. And I think that's the biggest takeaway I have from this conversation.
So Frank, this is really important. And this is what we really need to take, right? We need to look at air transportation as a system, and we need to think about like what are the different elements we need to really get to zero. And we need to think about it holistically. And we know that the contrail thing will address one part. We know that the fuels part can address the other parts. We also need to think a bit about the interplay of the two. That's obviously not unimportant. But I agree with you. Like we do need all of it, not just one of it.
Florian, thank you very much. This has been extremely enlightening. I know we went into some deep weeds at certain points, but I think this is knowledge that is important and worth sharing at this time. The final part of this interview is my favorite part, which is called a rapid fire round, in which we get to know you a bit more personally. You have to give me one word answers or a small phrase at best. So, for example, what's your favorite book?
You're asking me hard questions here. So in me still beats The Economist hard, so I will say The Nudge, Thaler and Sunstein.
Okay, Nudge, very good book. What's your favorite movie?
Over the last 2 years, I think the best one that I've watched was Oppenheimer.
Okay, so you didn't watch Barbie that season, you watched Oppenheimer.
So no, I'm clearly in team Oppenheimer. Well, my wife is clearly in team Barbie. We've watched both together.
Okay, sounds good. Favorite city?
Um, I don't think I can decide on one. Hamburg and Amsterdam.
Okay, are you from Hamburg?
Neither from Hamburg nor from Amsterdam. I've spent a lot of time in my life in Amsterdam because I grew up in Germany, so very close to the Dutch border. My parents had a boat in the Netherlands, so we sailed there a lot. So I spent a lot of my time in summers in Amsterdam. I've actually not been in Hamburg that often, but I absolutely love it.
Okay, favorite airline?
Delta with no questions, although I am a recent convert.
Is that because of the status?
No, it's more because I was a Lufthansa guy beforehand, but living in Boston, that gets you to Germany, but not to many other places.
Yeah, fair enough. What is something that you do in your free time?
I love the outdoors, so bike, hike, all that kind of stuff. And then on top of that, I will admit I'm surprisingly domestic, so I cook, I garden, and things like that. I like to get my hands dirty after a day at the computer.
Fantastic. Hands dirty. Maybe since we're both now in Boston, we should try to do that together. What is something you would like to learn?
I think pilot an aircraft, though it makes me slightly frightened to imagine myself in a pilot seat.
Okay, well, you're piloting a lot of studies, so that might help. Right.
Maybe, yeah.
What is the best advice you've received?
Not a piece of advice, it's more a saying. My PhD advisor used to tell people elegant but irrelevant. So I use this as a moniker to basically remind myself all the time, is what I'm doing actually relevant? So because if it's not, then it's elegant but irrelevant.
Love it. I can imagine a 2x2 matrix here, elegant and relevance.
Oh yeah, and I want to not be in the elegant but irrelevant bucket. That doesn't sound like good.
Fantastic. Florian, it has been a pleasure speaking with you. I'm so glad we finally managed to do it almost a year after, actually over a year after we first met. And thank you for the very, very insightful discussions.
It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you for Shashank.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Sustainability in the Air. Aviation is one of the hardest to decarbonize industries, yet there are multiple paths to get to net zero. Awareness is key to a green future. So please give us your support to help our sustainable aviation insights reach a wider audience. You can do this by sharing this episode on your network, on LinkedIn, Twitter, or even WhatsApp. Or perhaps you might consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to this episode. You can start a conversation with us by writing to us at podcast@simpliflying, that's simply with an i.com. And for more content on sustainable aviation, please visit our website green.simpliflying.com and join the movement. Sustainability in the Air is an original podcast by Simpliflying. The show is produced by Juraj Toth in Slovakia. Dirk Singer is our Director of Sustainability, who leads research for each interviewee out of Greenwich, UK. Shubhadeep Pal is our Supervising Editor based out of Mumbai and Singapore. The articles are written by Ayushi Badola in Dehradun in India and Meera Hull in Montreal, Quebec. Creative design is led by Ligia Esteve in Montreal. Baiba Drimen is the project director for the show based out of Valencia, Spain. Special thanks to Wendy Sim in Singapore. And I'm Shashank Nigam, the CEO of Simplifying and your host. Please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn.